So just by way of brief introduction before we get going today, I'm Amanda Bright. I am a journalism faculty here. I'm a senior academic professional, and I am the director of the Cox Institute Journalism Innovation Lab. I also am the managing editor of Grady News Source and the Oglethorpe Echo, our two working news organizations. And I'm part of the Solutions Journalism Hub of the South, which is now housed at UGA as well. So thanks for coming today. And my colleague.
Yes, I'm Chief Herndon. I'm the executive director of the Cox Institute. And we are organized under 3 labs, which we're going to talk about, the Innovation Lab some today. We have the Leadership Lab, the Innovation Lab, and the Writing Lab. Dr. Bright runs the Innovation Lab. Professor Lori Johnson runs our Writing Lab. And in addition to being the executive director of the overall Cox Institute, I run our Leadership Lab, which includes our flagship program, the 11 Leaders program. But we also kicked off another really important program last fall, our Certificate in News Literacy. So while we're here talking about that's probably not true or real, I want to give a brief update on the status of our news literacy certificate, if you want to.
I do want to, but it's not clicking.
There it goes.
There we go.
Okay, so we launched the certificate last fall in 2022 after more than a year of curriculum approval processes that goes all the way up through the chain, as anyone knows. I think we counted up there were 11 steps in the approval process, but we were in unanimous approval every step of the way, which I think was a testament to the university leadership and our faculty recognizing a need for a certificate like this. There is no application required, unlike many of the other certificate programs. This is simply an enrollment process because we want to encourage people to be news literate. It's also requires 4 classes, and they're listed there. Media, News, and Consumers, which is a big giant lecture class we do, is kind of the intro. We have 2 intermediate classes, Journalism, Ethics, and Diversity, and then Credibility, the News, Media, and Public Trust. And then we close that out with a capstone class, Media Savvy, Becoming Digitally Literate. The way this worked, we've already had 4 students graduate with their certificate, but if we can click over to the...
It's tired.
Maybe I can do it from over here. There we go. It just needs to be, I'm blocking it. I'm blocking it, I guess. So the status now, as we beginning of the fall semester, we have 79 students enrolled across 16 majors, and we're expecting to grow that to well over 100 during this academic year. You can just see a few of the listing of the majors outside of journalism. We have criminal justice, we have economics, we have international affairs, sports management, and a theater major. So I thought that was interesting. So we're getting some widespread interest in the program. Some of you know Charlotte Varnum. She is part of the part-time staff in the Cox Institute, and she operates with us as our program coordinator for this, in addition to her duties running the Red and Black. She and I are going to be meeting with advisors across the campus later in the semester as students get ramped up for their spring enrollment. We're really hoping to get some more interest in South Campus, particularly the College of Education. We think there's some really good interest there. So what's in it for students that are not journalism majors? Why do we care? We're doing a lot to position this certificate as a leadership skill. We believe in news literacy as a leadership skill. We're framing it as a foundation in ethical leadership. A lot of the material in our ethics course and our credibility course is around integrity, doing the right thing. So we framed a lot of that. The overall pedagogy that underpins the approach to our certificate, we put that together in a peer-reviewed pedagogical paper that we presented this past summer at the Association for Leadership Educators conference that was held in Nashville. Got tremendous review on that, and so the faculty that teaches the courses in the certificates, we've shared some of this information with them, and we think that we're bringing together a cohesive approach, journalism training with a framework around ethical leadership and the importance of integrity in our information ecosystem, and that's kind of what this whole thing is about, which is what Dr. Bright is going to talk about. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Bright now.
And I have to stand up. So my job today is to give you the entire 4-course sequence in 15 minutes. So hang on to your hats. But I think it's important. So I'm teaching the media literacy, the capstone class right now. We have about 60 students, and they're across majors. And one of the things that I find really interesting about it, and what Keith said, we are positioning them as leaders in whatever field they're going into. But I will tell you that they are fundamentally overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed by not knowing what to believe. They're overwhelmed by not knowing where to go for good information. They're so overwhelmed that they're not even really consuming news and information. So if we look at all the research around news literacy and media literacy, thank you, Mr. Black, that you will find that anyone really below 40 is not taking in legacy media at all anymore and is only relying on the feed on a digital product or platform that isn't based on an algorithm or someone else's curation for their idea of news, and it has absolutely no hierarchy, right? There's no news judgment, there's no this is more important than this, it's just coming at you. And so there is such a sense of, please just give me some parameters for how I can navigate the digital sphere when it comes to news and information. A lot of them don't want to check out, so we see news avoidance and news fatigue as real, tangible issues that we all feel too. I think that's actually not their end place, though. They don't want to stay there. They're there, but they want to go through and be able to figure out what to do next. So I'm just gonna give you a taste today of some of the stuff that we talk about, and we're gonna have some interaction, some questions and stuff too, because all of us are trying to figure this out together. And that's something that we try to underline a lot in all of our courses is like, this is not, no one has figured this out, okay? We haven't figured out our business model as a journalism industry. We haven't figured out news literacy, how to fact check, so much stuff that's out there. So we want to continue the conversation and bring new ideas. So one of the things I show them early on is just how widespread, and a lot of you in the back can't see the numbers, so don't worry about it. I'll just tell you what you need to know. It is digital platforms and digital access is just growing exponentially. So the amount of content we consume per day is about 8 times the amount that we consumed just a few months ago, okay, as far as what's publicly available. There is so much out there, and that is growing worldwide, that it's a volume problem because there's also a quality problem, which is kind of part of that. One of the ways that we try to frame this for our students and kind of give them a sense of how to get their hands around it is by using a taxonomy or a typology, because a lot of times they will say, that's untrue, that's fake news, right? That's misinformation, but what does that mean? And then what am I supposed to do about it? So their first kind of foray into this is just categorizing true versus false, but we all know that there's a lot of nuance between those two things in the real world. So we actually use a model developed by First Draft originally. First Draft is not really together in its original form still. Claire Wardle has gone on to different things. But this topology is probably the most widespread globally as far as trying to use names and separate what you see on digital platforms into specific categories. So everybody loves a good Venn diagram, am I right? Okay, so on the far left is misinformation. This is mistakes. This is why we do corrections. This is, I spelled that kid's name wrong on the Little League team and I'm getting the irate phone call, right? Misinformation. It happens. We develop processes as journalists to deal with that in a way that hopefully is credible and proactive. This also is true when your aunt shares something on Facebook that she firmly believes is true because she already believes it's true, so she thinks it's still true, and she puts it out into the world. She doesn't mean it to be false. She doesn't mean to trick or fool people, but ultimately she's spreading, at that point it becomes kind of misinformation, a mistake. Oops, I didn't mean to say something that was wrong. This is a decently small amount of what we see online. Mistakes happen, but in general, that's not the big category. The other far side is malinformation. This is stuff that has the intent to harm. We call these bad actors. That's like the nomenclature, but people who are going out into the world and sharing information that legitimately is supposed to destroy, hurt, or dismantle something, whether it's a structure or an individual. I will say there's a lot of debate in malinformation right now, since I'm talking to academics, I can get all nerdy, between whether or not it needs to be true. So leaks, technically, are malinformation. It's true information that is intentionally, deliberately meant to harm someone by its spread. But so are things that are completely made up, like deepfakes, right, that are meant to harm. And so there's a bigger question in the ecosystem right now about whether we should divide malinformation into whether or not it's true. But regardless, it's intent that I think you're kind of getting the hang of this that really makes this Venn diagram work. Oops, no, I totally meant to, and I want it to hurt someone. And then this area, technically these handles should be pulled out. If this was interactive, I could do that. Disinformation is probably the vast majority of what we actually encounter online. It's information that is slightly tweaked, manipulated, changed, pulled out of context, clickbaity, in a way that has a nugget of truth, but ultimately is doing something, what I like to say is disruptive. Disruptive doesn't always mean harm, but disruptive somehow just twists it sideways just a little bit. It can be super harmful. It can be like parody, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it somehow skews what is actually factually correct. Our students love this because they're like, oh, sometimes I'm seeing this, sometimes I'm seeing this, most of the time I'm seeing this, but you react to them differently, don't you? You know, you don't go with the same solution or the same response to all three of these. They're a very different context. Well, I can break it down even further because, again, who doesn't love a good chart with a taxonomy that's expanded? So these are actually types of disinformation kind of blown out. Some people will say these first few fall into misinformation too. We could debate that. We don't have time today. But this is kind of a sliding scale. At one end is satire or parody. Some people don't like this being included, mostly because it makes them feel bad, like for watching John Oliver or like doing the things that they enjoy doing. But you all know someone who was fooled by the Onion or the Babylon Bee, right? Or someone who shared something that was supposed to be funny, like that SNL cold open, and they were like, "That's so true," and you're like, "Ooh, that's parody." So it ends up being on the scale because some people do believe it's true. We go all the way down here to fabricated content, 100% made up, like the little guy in sunglasses here, just not at all true, okay? And then there are these shades of gray, and you have seen these. Like it's gonna come to you as I say it. False connections, when headlines, visuals, or captions don't support the content. Pretty much every news organization, TV stations, and the AJC are really bad about this. You scroll down far enough, it's just a big pile of clickbait down there, right? And that's really what it is. They're trying to get you to click through or read something, but when you go, it's very unsatisfying. It doesn't say anything like it's supposed to say. That's a type of disinformation. Misleading content is the use of information to frame an issue or individual. It's mostly true, but I'm using it in a kind of a weaponized way, kind of an agenda setting gone wrong. False context is when I take something and I pull it out of its original context, present it in a different context in order to fool or manipulate. Imposter content, you've seen this before, right? Like abcx.com, right? Where it looks just like the BBC, but it's not. I just gave a clue. Shoot. We'll get back to that later. And then manipulated content is where you usually use a technical skill to slow, change, or alter. So think Photoshop, think slowing down the audio, think speeding up the video, manipulations that are kind of physical to a real event that are misleading. The interesting thing about all these last chart, I promise, actually I don't know if I promised that, there may be more charts, but intent matters here too. This is the motivation by which someone would make a parody. Or why would they do imposter content? Well, possibly to parody, possibly to provoke or punk someone, possibly to profit, and possibly to promote propaganda. And absolute kudos to First Draft for making all of those start with P. Right? That's good.
You know, but the comment about parody, I think it's interesting that the Onion is losing readership because they can't come up with anything that's more absurd than the real news. You know, it's
it really does
interesting.
Pull all your creative juices right out when things are kind of crazy. So one of the reasons, again, I give this to our students and we talk through it on a regular basis, and we right now in class, they're finding examples and trying to categorize it, is again because we can't just say fake news. That is a very counterproductive, kind of dismissive way to go about it. we need to be like, okay, what is it doing? What is it? Why did they do it? And then when we understand that, we can really start thinking about solutions, proactive steps in order to counteract it in various ways. So you're a smart group, so I think it's time for a quiz. Wouldn't you agree? Sure, says Dr. Hume. So I've got the categories up there. Again, this is why you don't sit in the back unless, and maybe you have really good eyes. So we have satire or parody at the bottom, and then all the way up to fabricated content. Let me just, example A, Exhibit A. Breaking news, the general election is going to be held over 2 days. Due to an unprecedented increase in the number of registered voters, we're going to have the election over 2 days to decrease congestion in polling stations. The Liberal Democrat and Green Party should vote on Thursday, June 8th as usual. The conservative supporters should now vote on Friday, June 9th. Please be aware, if you vote for the wrong party or on the wrong day, your vote doesn't count. How would you categorize this, media savvy sleuths? Parody. Fabricated. Whoa! We just did that. This is harder than it looks, and the students really, they kind of, right? It's hard to know the intent, and that's kind of the motivating factor behind that. Was this supposed to fool, or was this supposed to be playful and funny? We'd have to know the larger context to do this, and I absolutely just robbed it of its context and threw it up on a slide, so you're limited. Are you seeing elements of other things I talked about between those two that might help us?
Misleading.
Right? What does it look like? What organization? Yeah, what is it? Yeah, it looks like the BBC. It's the BBC's old, yeah. Do y'all not read the BBC online? Okay, that's okay. Maybe they could do that this afternoon. Okay, this is like the BBC breaking news flag. It's a little dated and old, but it's basically still like this. It's also their font. Imposter content too. Now, there are overlapping pieces of this, but again, I'm going to deal with imposter content different than I'm going to deal with parody, different than I'm going to deal with fabricated content, so I'd have to kind of get down to the essence of that. Let's try another one.
Look. Is it 2016 or 2020?
That was 2016. I remember that one.
It was the first time. What would you call this as a type of information disorder?
I mean, it's certainly misleading content.
Mm-hmm.
It's also clickbait. I think this is like one of the ones that they were trying to get you to click.
Yeah.
To get traffic to their
Well,
site.
one of the easiest ways to identify clickbait is two pictures juxtaposed with a really thin gutter, right? As if they're in the same room and kind of hanging out together. That happens all the time. You will see, whenever you see two pictures right next to each other that are different, you're like, oh, that's probably trying to get me to go forward.
I guess the question is, those categories are just clearly not mutually exclusive, right?
Correct.
I mean, and that's the problem. I mean, it's satire, it's fabricated, it's manipulated. I mean, it's all of those things. So I guess when you try to apply that to any given instance, I mean, it's got some value, but I don't think that these things clearly fall into the same category.
So the reason is because bad actors or people who do this use various tools. They don't just go, I'm going to pick this lane today, right, and do this. In general, they're going to employ several tools together. For me, I would just call this fabricated. He didn't endorse him. It's just not true, right? I mean, did I miss something? I'm pretty sure he didn't. Okay, so just basic false. Now, are they using other elements? Like they're trying to look a little bit like a news site? Yes, right. But I think, again, the dissection of this and the conversation around it is particularly helpful. Okay, let's get to a different example that does something a little bit different. This is a tweet. It's a verified account, so it absolutely must be okay. And by tweet, I mean an X. I don't know what I mean. This is what happens when government believes people are illegal, kids in cages. We've talked about 36,000 likes. Any ideas? This one's a little bit more clear cut, so that'll make Glenn happy.
This is a false connection. It's a photo of something else.
Right. False context, but it's totally okay that you didn't use exactly the right word since you learned it 5 seconds ago. This actually was a protest that people set up. They put up, so the protesters put up a fence and they were protesting behind it, and the little kid was just done. He was just done for the day. He was like, I'm. And so he happened to be with the protesters and he was just tired, okay? He wasn't actually in a cage in any way, shape, or form. Always look for close crops. Okay, 9 times out of 10, if they have cropped the context out of a picture, you've moved from journalism into information disorder, or just you've made a bad choice. This is a different one, in a different category pretty clearly.
Can you read that for the people in the back?
Immigration police arresting people at voting booths, and then the same thing in Spanish.
I was going to say manipulated content because it almost looks Photoshop based off the way the lighting is different to the people in the background versus the subjects in the foreground.
Yes! Like you could, right? You can just kind of see this, like the sun shining a little differently. It's a tiny little halo. People who know how to do Photoshop will go, yeah, like that's not an exact match. So 2 pictures juxtaposed. Here's the other way you know, and my students always get this right away, but like older people don't, no offense. But younger people do. What would all those people be doing in line if that was happening? They would have their phones out and they would be faced that way and recording it. The fact that they're standing there nonchalantly as if nothing's happening, not in our society. That's not going to happen, right? And it's all these little cues, right? So this would be absolutely manipulated content, 100% gold star. Last one. Appellate judges confirmed during the first congressional term. Ronald Reagan has 19. George Bush, the first one, 18. Bill Clinton, 18. George W. Bush, 16. Barack Obama, 15. Donald Trump, 24. Oh, my data viz friends, I feel your love.
So it's competitive misleading content because the visual is misleading even if the numbers are accurate.
Right, like if we put some scales on this, like a y-axis that actually made sense, this otherwise it has an agenda because it's being manipulated, right? So these are all the things that we work through with our students in order to get them to like just a real quick, academic side road, which is we talk about Foucault a lot and power knowledge, right? That when we control the knowledge, we have the power, and those things are inextricably linked. And we talk a lot about agenda setting and framing as a responsibility of the press, but also one that can very easily be manipulated or altered in a way that's problematic. Because we live in a fragmented media ecosystem, we've developed all of these sub-channels, which are wonderfully liberating, but also then create sock puppets and trolls and bots and all these other little fun things we had to name, like things like astroturfing. Those people who go put 5-star reviews on everything on Amazon and then you buy it and find out it's junk. That's astroturfing. There are sub-channels and subcultures that have developed around these types of things. And this is what we're always getting students to kind of think about and watch for. That the data, the information, the comment section that you see could easily be one of these kind of activated subcultures. And that power and knowledge are a thing, like legitimately, they're together. They exist in the same space. And that's one of our big responsibilities in our field, but it's also one of the biggest liabilities in our field.
Yes, I think it's important that we think about it. To your point, Glenn, earlier, they fit in buckets. What was the message creator's intent? Right. How do we get the people that are in this area to think about what was the intent? Was the intent to be satire, or was the intent to be misleading or to cause harm?
Right.
So sometimes that gets back into that integrity question.
Absolutely.
Right? So what was the creator of the message's intent? And can we, through lots of different tools and things, can we discern in some cases what that intent was? Where did the message originate from? How was it distributed? And from some of those technical things,
right,
you can also then determine intent,
right,
in some cases. And then when you know the intent, then you can easily, more likely, put it in some of those buckets, right?
Yeah, but it is not easy. Like, it is not like a matching game, right, where you just flip over 2 cards that match in any way. And I think that's why the students are both empowered and struggle with the larger taxonomy. Two more scary things, and then we'll get to things that aren't as scary, because at this point you look a little bit frightened about the whole world and the information in it, so we don't want to leave you there.
Until I talk again.
That's actually true. He's going to depress you. I'll see if I can come back at the very end. This is called the Trumpet of Amplification, one of the coolest drawings that exists with the coolest name. And we also talk to our students, and this is what I'll be talking about tomorrow in class, how disinformation moves through a media ecosystem, because that's also important for them to understand as journalists, but also as citizens. It's not just someone writes a post somewhere and then someone shares it a couple times. It's way more nuanced and intentional than that. And so we talk about how things start off on the anonymous web, good old 4 and 8chan, and right at the dark web, places like this, picked up by semi-closed or closed networks. Sometimes these actually can be even like GroupMe's and things like that, which is odd, right? But places that only allow certain people to come through, it propagates there because it's with people you trust or you think you have something in common with. Picked up and amplified by conspiracy communities that are looking for those conversations and then amplifying them more. Then it goes on to mainstream social media. And then from there, professional media has to look at it and go, okay, do we talk about it because people are talking about it, or do we not talk about it because we don't want people to talk about it? And that being just a super critical moment. We call it the tipping point, where we're like, okay, so where is our audience at? Do they know too much? Or by talking about it, will we just give it more oxygen and it will bloom? Big, huge, unanswerable questions. Woohoo! The last thing that I will point out, and this is like a horrible chart. I mean, it's just horrible. But there's a life cycle of media manipulation that we talk about with our students. A lot of times what they will think is, hey, so this disinformation or information disorder gets out into the world, someone fact checks it, and then poof, right? Because everyone watches 11 Alive Verify or reads the New York Times fact check. We absolutely know through research that fact checking doesn't hit the audience it needs to hit. The people who read those fact check stories or watch those segments are the people who didn't already believe the thing anyway. So we have not seen that as a really viable lane for fixing or correcting or addressing information disorder. Not that we should never do it, but in general, it's preaching to the proverbial choir. What we see happen in media manipulation campaigns is you start one, they seed it across social platforms, and then they watch us, and by journalism professionals, politicians, leaders. They watch how we respond to it. They watch which part we find unbelievable. They watch which parts aren't selling as well as others. They go back in, they subtly manipulate it, and then they resend it back out in a way that is going to be, so it's like we're beta testers. In a bad way for what they're doing. And so media manipulation life cycles are recursive. Right? There's not like an end to it. You can take that piece and see it again. And because of human psychology, which is the more we see it, the more we tend to believe it's true. If I see it pop up 5 or 6 times in different places, I'm like, oh, that must be the case, right? In my subconscious, then this ends up working beautifully well. Okay, you are thoroughly depressed. You've seen these, right? The students and I spend a lot of time wrestling with these. These are not something to go, oh, well then I'm middle right, or whatever, like no. It's to be wrestled with. It's to think about why someone would have categorized things in certain ways and why everything is on the political spectrum instead of thinking about media diversity as local versus global, or gender, race, ethnicity, religion. Like, so many different ways we can consume diverse media besides for always going to the political polls. That being said, what makes me most happy, I use Jamboards because I think they're cool. It's a Google product for my big 60-person lecture. What I think is most interesting is when we got to the end of wrestling with those, this is what students said when I asked them, what is a characteristic of a credible journalist or a credible news organization? Reports on the news by actually going to the scene. Verify all their info, owning their mistakes when they're wrong, covering a range of perspectives instead of sticking to a specific agenda, backing things up, primary sources, repetition, or it should be reputation and validity, but that's okay. it's like they're getting it, right? But they also start getting that most of what they consume is not this. Upwards of 80 to 90% by their own admission. Most of what they consume is not big J journalism. It's just content. And so no wonder they're confused, right? And they're kind of struggling in that way. So I don't want to particularly leave you in the sad place. I will tell you that we talk about things like, hey, here's some things we could try to address this problem. We could be more transparent about how journalism's made and what journalists are and what we do. That's what the Trusting News organization is all about. We can help audiences understand us. We can distinguish better between trained journalists and just citizens with technology, right? Some students definitely go for the 4th and 6th. They want people to label and delete false information on digital platforms, and they want government regulation of digital spaces, and then I bring up the pesky First Amendment, and then we have like a thing, you know. And so, but a lot of them really do want, they want it gone. They want it so they don't have to deal with figuring it out. But then we talk about the repercussions of that. It becomes a little more complex. One of my favorite is make news free. Because you know where all the good information is? Behind a paywall. You know where all the bad information is? Free. Free flowing. Do we intentionally build trust with news audiences, and how do we do that? Do we train them, starting when they're little tiny babies, to be news literate and to understand this stuff? These are all good tools, right? All good solutions, all good ideas. And I think we try to talk about those, but I want to kind of go even easier for both a journalist and for a citizen. And to me, this is kind of like ground zero of just do sheep, which by the way is just a fun acronym for lots of reasons. I taught this to my children when they were young, and they still do it. My daughter's like, is there going to be a High School Musical 4? I don't know. I saw an article online, but I'm going to use sheep. You know, cool. And this is stuff that we all do, but are we systematic? Particularly before we share or say to our loved ones over dinner, did you hear, right? Whenever you hear yourself about to say that, you should go, have I checked this? We can't check everything, we know that, right? We can't police the world. But the stuff that we're gonna propagate forward, we can run it through some of these tools. I will tell you that people normally check the source, but they don't always go back into the history, right? And that usually is a good one. They may look for evidence, but they don't always think about emotion and loaded language, particularly if it falls into their own worldview and is confirming what they already believe to be true. They tend to not be as critical. They're like, of course that's true, yes, I hate him, whatever. And that's a huge problem for students. And then we talk a lot about images too. And again, this is just a tool, basic, super easy. You can just click through, and it allows everyone from, a high-minded academic down to my little children, just take a minute and stop and think about things. We talk a lot about something called lateral reading. It's the best strategy, to my knowledge, that exists. It essentially means open another tab. So sometimes we try to find the answer on the thing itself, and that's actually not possible because it's well crafted or because we're all up in our own head about the thing itself. Open 1, 2, 3 more tabs, and then search laterally, read laterally. And again, it's not like you're always going to get the perfect evidence, or the perfect context. You're gonna find all the weaknesses, but you will find a destabilization moment where you're like, wait, okay, this feels fish, right? And then all of a sudden you can go, okay, let me not approach this the way I was approaching it before. Knowing that time is a consideration. So we talk about laterally reading humans quoted or cited, organizations affiliated or involved, data and facts. Just open a new tab. Just open a new tab. Anyone can do it. Doesn't take a special tool or plugin. Takes about 5 or 10 minutes, and that helps the students a lot. Helps me a lot. And then we talk a lot about visuals. Imagine that, right, Kaiser? So July 30th, 2020, a funeral, not a mask in sight. Is anyone awake yet? Turns out this picture was actually from September 2015. right? This is classic case of false context, pulling something out and building a different context around it. There are tons of great free tools, and the one I would encourage you to just, if you use Chrome as a browser, it's called Revi, R-E-V, Revi. You install it as a Chrome browser extension. Any image on any website you're looking at, you right-click and you click that little Revi button, and it will come up with all the places where that picture has been over the internet, other places. It's like a one-stop shop, and it looks at Yandex, Bing, Google, TinEye, one other one I can't remember. To me, this is like my first go-to. If I see a picture and I'm like, that's fishy, chances are it's from 5 years ago. Or chances are they cropped it so severely that you're not actually seeing what's going on. And that's a really easy, cool way to do it. Also, there's some actually really good video tools where you can upload the YouTube video and it will run like a history check on it. And those bottom two tools are that. So there are tools that help you do this, and they're decently quick and easy. But I will tell you, the sheep and the lateral reading will probably get you there too, right? Given 5 minutes in a decently quick internet connection, you'll be able to at least see what's going on. Last thing I want to talk about before Keith depresses you about AI are these three concepts. This is really what gets us, particularly as educated, academic style people. We would like to think that we are high-minded and open and above such things, but in general, we want to believe we're right. It's a basic human desire to think that what's going on in your own head is okay and correct. And so these three concepts, although slightly, strangely, nuancedly different, all lead us to that first response of seeing information disorder. And if it aligns in any small way with what we already believe to be true, we just soak it in, right? As we're scrolling. And I think knowing that this is human psychology helps. And then just, taking time to check ourselves. So my husband, which is ironic, is like a Redditor. And Reddit is a bit of a cesspool. And like wild and crazy things go on. And he'll constantly go, oh, did you see this? And I'm like, oh my gosh, now I have to fact check it. Like I was eating dinner. As long as we're kind of in that space where we're approaching things with that critical objectivity, not just of the world, but in our own head, I think we're going to do okay. I think we are. I think we can navigate the information ecosystem. But it's part critical judgment of what's out there and part critical judgment of what we want to believe. And making sure we think through those things. And we do this in all of our classes, but journalists cannot be objective individually, right? We don't have the power. We don't have the ability. We're human. We bring stuff to the table, but the process can get us a long way there. And so we just talk a lot of times in my capstone specifically about the fact that you should not be sending content directly to an audience. You've got to have a couple layers of journalistic process between you and them. And that's what makes it journalism. That's what makes it, the thing that we ethically care about. And they're shocked by this because they do really believe that an individual journalist can try hard enough and be completely fair and balanced and objective. And I just think that's an unrealistic expectation for them. It's through the process of a diverse staff that allows you to talk to each other and think through things and edit things that we can arrive at a good place because of all this. Okay, AI, and then I'm going to end on a happy note, whether you like it or not.
So this whole idea of AI really started striking me as very important to our profession back in May, and I'll get to why that was the case. So I started looking around on what I wanted to do with some of my summertime, and so I took a 5-week course that got me certified as a prompt engineer. That's really cool, right? I can put that on my resume. My CV is a prompt engineer. Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's really interesting because I really don't have enough Python training to actually be a real certified prompt engineer, even though I have a certificate from the Blockchain Council that says I am. But the point of the training that I did and what I took away from that is the whole idea of prompt engineering and the way we think of it is you're essentially interviewing a computer. The whole idea of doing prompts in AI is that you're interviewing a computer. And the same thing that happens when you interview a human happens when you interview a computer. Sometimes the person will give you hyperbole. Sometimes the person will actually lie to you. Sometimes when you interview a computer, it will give you hyperbole, and sometimes it will lie to you. The computer doesn't know it's lying. It just hasn't been trained properly, and in the world of AI, they call it hallucinating. Right. Right? And so you can end up with false information. But if we think about it from a journalistic process, the whole idea of prompt engineering is interviewing a computer, and approach it from that standpoint. I think we can then start seeing how we can use that in a professional way in some ways. So Janice is going to be scheduling a session in the spring, I believe. We're going to take the whole idea of AI a little deeper, and I'm hoping I can bring a couple of my colleagues from over at the Institute for Artificial Intelligence that will come in and talk to us. We're going to look at dates and figure out what we wanted to do. But in the context of this conversation, I wanted to at least mention a little bit about AI and why it's important. Well, one of the things that's important is it has taken the world by storm. This is a Price Waterhouse analysis of common platforms and how long it took to reach 100 million users. TikTok, for example, took 9 months to reach 100 million users once it was actually unleashed on the public. It only took ChatGPT 2 months to reach 100 million users. So if we're not thinking that AI is out there and it's being used, and when you start looking at how it's being used, a lot of times it's being used for pure entertainment purposes. People just want to type in something and see what they get back, right? It's not even intended sometimes to be informational. Right. So it's really interesting that it's captured the world's imagination, and we have to figure out how this is going to play in our space, particularly when so much of it is being used to generate information that is not real. Particularly when we talk about images through places like Midjourney, through places like Stock, IMG. There's a lot of these places that are using this. Take it outside of the academic construct for a second, and whether our students are using it to write essays and things like that. That's a different discussion. But in the context of journalism, we're seeing that a tremendous amount of AI is being deployed to create deep fakes, to create things that go beyond a mere Photoshop manipulation, right? And as I said, I got really entrenched in this discussion. I became really deeply interested back in May when something happened that I thought, wow, okay, this is Terminator here. This is this is weird. And so what happened was that there was an AI-generated image of an explosion that supposedly occurred at the White House and the Pentagon. Okay? So these images were intentionally created on AI. The creators did not intentionally intend for them to make harm, but they were released onto social media, and then the algorithms of social media amplified these images. And they went viral in a matter of minutes. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people saw these images. But what I thought was really interesting is that the algorithms on Wall Street saw that this was trending, and immediately the market started tumbling on Wall Street, right? So we had algorithms elevating false imagery, and we had algorithms reacting to that false imagery. Humans had turned over that moment in time to the machine, right? And that, honestly, some of the social media platforms started pulling down those images, and the Wall Street algorithms figured out, okay, this isn't real, and life was restored to normal relatively quickly that day. But it was a glimpse into algorithms reacting to algorithms. And it really started me thinking on what is AI? What do I need to know about this? How does this stuff work? And that's what got me into this thing, and start looking at it from journalistic perspective, it really is fascinating when you start thinking about how social media can take this and amplify it, and then what are going to be the society reactions to some of this stuff, right? And so we have to put that in that context and be thinking about how we're going to deal with AI in the overall context of information creation and in the overall context of information disorder and how that plays. Because it is in my opinion, it's a real threat to how we think about certain institutions and how these institutions react. And one of the major ones is Wall Street. I mean, it could have been much worse than it was, right? In that particular situation. So I think it's interesting. This particular example is featured on the News Literacy Products Rumor Guard site. So it was really interesting to me. I was actually seeing it in real time back in May when that started happening, and it was interesting to see that the News Literacy Project had picked that up and featured it as one of the examples of what's happening out there with fabricated images and the response to some of those fabricated images, right?
Yep.
So, we're going to definitely consider that, and I hope when we get the schedule for Janice, we're going to do a brown bag and do a much deeper dive in AI and talking about some of the societal ramifications. And like I said, I'm hoping that we can get some people from our Institute of Artificial Intelligence to come and join me and talk about that.
So one of the things that I would emphasize about what Keith just said too is that, I think AI is destabilizing and disrupting. Yeah, but like we've always had that. I mean,
Right.
Things destabilize and disrupt, and then we have to adjust. Sometimes our industry has been better than other times at its speed of adjustment, but we're trying to really teach students to not be frightened out of their minds about things like this, not to abuse them, but to understand where the pathway will be and try to envision what that will look like. So these are the big 5 things that we talk about. So if you were going to oh crap, there's a lot of bad things out there. What do I do? This is where I would go next. Number 1, most important thing you can do is diversify your digital media diet. And we spend 2 whole weeks in my capstone class where they just really reflect on the information they're taking, where they're taking it from, what that means, and if they're even seeing other perspectives. We don't always want to follow or engage with things that seem diametrically opposed to our worldview or morals or our values. But it is super important, particularly as communicators, that we know what people are hearing and what is being said, and how it's being communicated in all ways. So for whether it's local to global, right to left, any of the different ways we can diversify, I want them to intentionally diversify their digital media consumption. And that's a really hard row for a lot of them, but I believe that this actually, when Keith was talking about that incident, if you've got a really diverse digital media diet, you're going to know fairly quickly that that's not true, right? But if you're in a certain lane, you may be tricked a lot longer. So that's why it's so valuable. Number 2, we verify everything if we're going to embed or share. We've got to go through the verification process. It's okay not to verify everything on your feed, but if we are going to in any way propagate it, we have to be responsible and make sure that we vet it. Avoid giving oxygen or legitimacy to things that are not true. And a lot of news organizations have adopted really interesting policies about not resharing the bad photo, right? Like Keith just showed you, and they've got watermarks all over it and stuff, because it can easily be reshared again. But being really careful about, even if you see something outrageous, telling everybody about it, right? But it's not true, but oh my gosh, did you see this? Like there's an element of, be careful, right? I mean, we're still propagating that. Lateral reading for context all the time. Open more tabs. You can never really have enough tabs as far as I'm concerned. And then number 5, look for common ground. We spend a whole unit in our last class about how to have conversations with people who are in the information disorder world. And psychologically, that can be a really challenging thing, particularly to people you love, to say, oh my gosh, that's not true. Like, how do you have that conversation? So we do a lot of reading and thinking about human psychology, and then figuring out what you have in common and working from that place. There's a lot of good TED Talks about it. And so we work with them on that. So a positive thing to leave you with. This is the big question I asked my students last week. What would having a diverse, credible media diet mean for individuals and or our society? So if we did this, what would it mean? Social media would be more of a little treat than something we're dependent on. Lower polarization of the news. People would be more empathetic to others. expanding our news consumption with better understanding, connection, and education. It would provide a doorway to more meaningful, intriguing conversations with different people. It's like freaking utopia up here, right? This is amazing. I actually took a picture of this and made it my background on my other computer. I think we can move past the middle school phase of information disorder that we're currently kind of locked in. But it's going to have to be a super intentional step. And that's really what the Certificate of News Literacy is all about. And what we're trying to do is equip students to be leaders in this space, not just vocationally, but personally as citizens, so that they can identify, address, and then actually go out and try to help solve and move our way forward so that we can have more truth in the world. Yay. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're glad to take questions.
Dr. Hume.
I know this is new, the news literacy certificate is new, but I'm wondering, in the experience that you've had so far, are you seeing a difference in the students who are ours and the students who are coming from other places in terms of their understanding of how media works? Or is it pretty much, are they all on the same playing field?
I think from the perspective of the big giant intro class, we get a very diverse set of students. Like this semester, I have 201 in that class, and only about a third are intended journalism. So 2/3 are something else, and that's where we're attracting some students from that other, that pool into the certificate. And I don't know that we can say that they're coming at it from a different perspective at this point.
Not yet.
I think that we don't have enough information, but I would echo what Amanda said about the sense of being overwhelmed. I think that we're on the verge of something that I'm calling, I think I read this somewhere, but I picked it up and adopted it, information anxiety.
Yeah.
And there is part of that is just this really fragmented nature of our social media. I mean, just a few years ago, the average person had 2 to 3 social media accounts. The average person now has
lovely.
6 to 7.
Wouldn't it, Sarah, to have that?
Right? 6 to 7, and that fragmentation of information in the pipeline is overwhelming this generation of media consumers. And I think the people that are coming into the certificate are looking for, how can I manage my information consumption?
So
right? That's it. Yeah.
And because I teach the capstone, he's the beginning, alpha and the omega,
Right.
that if the post that my students just did, the one thing that almost all of them said that were journalism majors is, well, I had to get the AP app for $31.90 for reporting one. And so now I know I at least
30.
get that information, right, for the AP app or whatever it was. They are, because they were forced to in our journalism classes, consume specific, credible information. Some of that has rubbed off on them, and that is very different from the students who are not majoring in journalism. They come in and they're like, all I look at is Instagram and TikTok, and that's 100% of my diet. I'm just going to be honest with you. Whereas the journalism majors come in and they have been exposed to, or at least shamed into, other forms of media and consumption, and they understand why it's valuable. I will say I had an amazing comment from a journalism major this week that was, I know it's hard to hear bad things and report on bad things and to take in the news, but if we don't know what's going on, we can't do anything about it. And it was just kind of like an epiphany for the whole class. And I think, again, that came from from one of ours.
With respect to your last question, I think I'd be a little cautious that it's all utopia.
Okay,
Do
fair.
that.
Yeah, that's a bit hyperbole, like an AI would.
One of the things that Mike Cacciatore and I found in the study we did during COVID about health decision making, we asked people about their media use and their media diets. And the people who said they had a balanced media diet were the most uncertain about whether they should get a COVID vaccine, were the least confident in terms of the information that they were getting, and had the hardest time trying to figure out what to do with the information from over here and the information from over here. Whereas the people who were anchored in one side or the other were completely confident that they were doing the right thing, and they had no trepidation. So I think it's probably a true phenomenon. And if you're going to look, especially if you're talking about things that matter, right? Making medical decisions or making health decisions. And if you're not a health expert, looking at a wide array of sources is likely to cause you more confusion than to lead you to utopia.
Okay.
But if you are looking at, if you're convinced that you're looking at the right sources, but they're actually the wrong sources, then you're going to also be led to a bad outcome.
Yeah, but these people, we're talking about mainstream media sources on both sides, and ones who were, in both camps were reporting that, they did know what was true and what they should trust because they were confused. And so there is a potential, the more diverse your media diet, the more likely you are going to be, again, it depends on what decision-making you're in.
Right, if certainty is the goal versus understanding multiplicative viewpoints.
I was gonna say the research on how well confidence tracks to like the quality of your decision-making also isn't that great, right? People are confident about things all the time that they fuck up.
Right.
It's like, that necessarily shouldn't be the be-all end-all, but.
Right.
Yeah, you see some of those kind of studies around purchase decisions. I'm confident I got the best deal on my automobile, but then when you actually track that against the best deal, you were totally ripped off, right? And so to your point,
bias.
you can be confident in something and still be completely wrong.
Yeah, but I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I get you.
I also think the media does a better job of covering some things than others, and I think we can all agree that COVID was not our finest.
It was not our finest moment.
So, yeah.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
I got a question for Dr. Wright for one of your 20 other hats that you kind of wear, which is sort of looking at big picture curriculum issues and mass communication. So one of the things you mentioned sort of in your 5 ways to treat this stuff is sort of getting a better understanding of psychology. Like, what do you think is the role in an undergrad journalism or advertising or any kind of communication curriculum of like social psych, media psych, any of this kind of stuff as sort of foundational, better as opposed to just like let's write leads a lot?
Correct. This is a huge gap, and a lot of it. So if we come at it from a journalistic standpoint, like a big J journalism, like a traditional big J journalism standpoint. We can frame it as understanding your audience, right, and audience engagement. And the ways that our industry really is struggling right now is because we are still not, even though we're giving a lot of lip service to it, we're still not caring about the audience more than we care about ourselves. And I think that is the foundation of building that up, is what do people need and want? My students for the Oglethorpe Echo, we read a really big American Press Institute study of 5,000 readers about what they really want in local journalism, and we were just like, oh, well, we should do that then probably, like instead of the thing that we're doing, right? Because we've always done it, and I think that comes directly from sociology, psychology, understanding the way institutions used to work versus what they work now, and then what the expectations are of the people that we're serving. And I think even the word audience needs to probably go out the window. We need to be saying community. Right? We're serving a community. We're not serving an audience. They're not passively just sitting by. They're engaged with what we are doing. And all of that, to me, has that psychological underpinning. And in the other communications fields, even more so.